Bible, Daniel.
We're picking up in the book of Daniel, and Daniel, a very intriguing book, a very, in some ways, complicated book. The prophecies are dramatic, the stories are dramatic. Some of the most famous stories in all the Bible come out of Daniel. We've got the stories in kind of Daniel and his buddies. We've got prophecies, we got dreams by others, and then we got dreams by Daniel. And so the book is kind of divided up right in the middle. The first 6 chapters talk about Daniel and some of the experiences and the interpreting dreams of others. And then starting in chapter 7, we see Daniel's dreams, his visions that he begins to have. And that, so we've got kind of a demarcation there where the book's divided from the first 6 chapters to the next 6 chapters. Daniel came into Babylon, and he was part of what they called the first deportation. When the land of Israel was being invaded by Babylon, the tribes of Judah specifically, the land of Judah specifically, and they were being taken captured. Their kings were being overwhelmed by Babylonian authorities, and so there were groups of people that left Judah and were taken to Babylon, and Daniel was part of that first group in about 606 BC. Now we finished with Ezekiel. Ezekiel was part of the second group about 10 years later that he went to Babylon. And so both Ezekiel and Daniel, their ministry was taking place in that land of Babylon, the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, and so in that area. So Daniel was part of that first group. And finally, Daniel even extends to the point where he's still there when the Babylonians fall and it's taken over by the Medes and the Persians. Later in his life, Darius the Mede begins to rule in that region, and Daniel continues to serve under him. So all of this, the story of all the drama, the miracles, the visions that take place, this is all taking place in the land that we'd probably refer to as Babylon, Persia, and it's taken over by the Medes later on. So the time frame we get out of the first chapter, verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." So we see that here's the beginning of the fall of Jerusalem. It was prophesied in Ezekiel. We say, in fact, Ezekiel, at one point we were reading, he's already in Babylon and he gets word that Jerusalem has fallen, because he went in at about 596 BC, and Jerusalem fell about 10 years later. Well, here was part of the besieging of Jerusalem was already taking place during the reign of Jehoiakim. And it says, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar." It's important to, here it says that some of the vessels, because that comes into play in a later story as we look in Daniel. Brought him to the house of God, he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then in verse 3, it says here, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking," wow, "showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's courts, and he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans." So here we see that some of the choice guys, the young guys out of the captives there, out of the ones that were coming from Judah, were taken in to be trained into the king's court. They're going to raise them up, see which one of these guys can be useful to the king and can be useful in the Babylonian kingdom. And Daniel was among those. So it says there in verse 6, "Now among them were the sons of Judah, among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego." And it's interesting to me that, as we go on and we read through this, we always refer to Daniel as Daniel. We don't call him Belteshazzar, but we call the other guys Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We kind of adopted their Babylonian names, but we didn't adopt Daniel's Babylonian name. Anyway, just a little side note. So these guys are taken in. They're looked as possible ones to serve the Babylonian Empire here, to serve the king, serve in the king's courts, and serve as officials. in the Babylonian reign there. It's interesting, it says they took those that were kind of a little bit above. They were like, they were prospering. They looked like they were exceeding the others in their appearance and their wisdom and their understanding and just that kind of thing. It reminded me of a story when I was in overseas in a Muslim country, and some friends that were living there said to me, says in their home country in Africa, when the witches in that town would find people, young people that seemed to be excelling above the others in intelligence and good looks and understanding and knowledge, they would begin to curse them until they would become sick and die, because these witches didn't want anyone rising up above their level. It just reminded me of that, because here we see kind of the opposite. In the Babylonian Empire, they tried to take those and use their abilities and train them. They weren't as intimidated as the witches were, I guess, in this other society. Anyway, that was a real side note. And as we go on in chapter 1, Daniel, in this position with his buddies, they were given special food and drink. They were given wine to drink, the king's wine and the king's food. And Daniel said, I don't want that. I don't want any of that. Just give me vegetables. And the guy that was overseeing them says, well, what if I just give you vegetables? You're going to start looking pretty puny. I'm going to get in trouble if you do this. So they decided, in verse 12 it says, please test your servants for 10 days and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. So Daniel says, okay, we'll do it for 10 days. Interesting to me that number 10 in the Bible is used several times for time of testing. A lot of you might remember there were 10 plagues in Israel, or in Egypt, I mean. There were 10 times, the Lord said when they were going through the wilderness, these 10 times you've tested me in the wilderness. They didn't know that 10 was kind of the end of the road. In the book of Revelation, we say you'll be thrown in prison for 10 days. So you see this kind of 10 thing, and it's used here again. Daniel says, just give us 10 days, test us for 10 days and see what happens. Well, in verse 19 and 20 of chapter 1, it says, and the king called with them and talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's personal service. And as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the conjurers who were in that realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. So here it says they came out of that time of just eating vegetables and water. They looked better, they seemed stronger, they were more alert, they were outstanding among the captives there. And so they're raised up. Daniel and his three buddies are raised up to special positions. So then we enter into chapter 2, and the king has a dream. And he's got all these conjurers and sorcerers and magicians that are in his court, and he calls them and he says, I want you to tell me what my dream was, and then give me the interpretation. And they're like, hey, king, nobody does that. Nobody tells you what your dream was. You tell them your dream and then we'll interpret it. And he says, no. He was firm, and he said, unless you tell me my dream, I'm going to have you all killed. So they stall for a little bit, can't do it, and so the order goes out to kill all the magicians, conjurers, and sorcerers, etc. Well, Daniel and his buddies fall within that group. They're kind of the king's wise guys, the wisdom guys, and so they are under a death decree too. So Daniel says, hey, what's the big hurry here? I think God can give an answer. Give me a little time. I'm going to talk to my buddies. And so we see in chapter 2, verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, about the matter, in order that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel has asked for a little extra time. He goes and tells his friends, and says, hey guys, it's time to pray. We got like one day to pray. We got to pray this thing in, and we got to get an answer soon. See in verse 19, it says, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So we're entering in. Daniel gets the dream. He sees Nebuchadnezzar's dream in his own night vision. He's got the answer. And so he goes into very understandably, like 3 or 4 verses here of just a prayer of thanksgiving to God. Thank you for blessing us with this kind of wisdom. Thank you for giving this thing, because this looks like it's probably going to save not only their lives, but the lives of all these other guys that were in the king's courts, all the other magicians, conjurers, sorcerers, etc. So God had mercy even on them through Daniel, and gives Daniel not only the dream, but then the interpretation of the dream, which we're going to pick up with here as we extend on into chapter 2.